Welcome to Mad About Money. I'm Maddy Alexander-Grout, and this week we are doing a very, very special episode. Normally, we interview interesting people about their interesting money stories. Today, we're interviewing interesting people about everybody's money stories, I guess. I am joined by Greg and Simon from StepChange. Greg is a debt advisor and Simon is head of comms. So it's a pleasure to have you here with me, guys. Thank you so much for giving me some time, especially on your busiest week of the year, because we're here to talk about Debt Awareness Week.
Mhm.
So first of all, do you guys want to, Simon, do you want to tell me a little bit about StepChange and who you are and who you can help?
Yeah, of course. Firstly, yeah, thanks for having us on, Maddie. It's really
You're
great to
welcome.
be here.
Mhm.
StepChange is the UK's largest debt advice charity. So we help,
Mhm.
I would say, about 180,000 people a year
Wow.
through what
Mhm.
what we call debt advice, and then hundreds of thousands more with everything from budgeting advice to where to get benefits, anything like that. So I would say the easiest way to describe it is if there's any worries that you have about money, you can
Mhm.
come to Step Change, whether that's online or over the phone, and there'll be information on there that can help you get back on track.
That's
Definitely.
amazing.
Mhm.
So tell me a bit about what you both do. Greg, let's go to
Mhm.
you.
Like I said, mentioned a debt advisor. I'm kind of the first person people speak to when they come through to us. I kind of cover everything from, like Simon was saying, to helping people put together a budget, to just answering even just general questions about, um, you know, what solutions are out there, what kind of steps people can take for the collection process, any solutions that are eligible, things like that. We also have an online chat feature as well for people who don't like speaking on their phones. I do some shifts on that as well. So we do have multiple ways of people seeking debt advice.
That's amazing. And in particular for our community who are
Mm,
all neurodivergent and actually picking up the phone, whether you're
mhm,
neurodivergent or you have mental health issues, that can be quite a daunting thing, especially when it's talking
mhm,
about something so personal as debt.
definitely.
Simon, what's your role?
So yeah, as you mentioned, I'm sort of head of communications. So that would involve, from a kind of press point of view, I guess, working with journalists and the kind of wider media to get the word out there about step change. So obviously we're in Debt Awareness Week at the moment. So a big part
Mhm,
of our job is working with journalists to share client stories, to share research information that we have about the work that we do, and really try to get people to kind of write about us, to sort of bang the drum for people getting out there and getting help. And I guess the other side of it is that we also do a lot of advocacy work for,
mhm,
obviously Greg and the work that his colleagues do helps us to get an enormous amount of insight about, client data and people's profiles, why people fall into debt,
Mm.
and we'll use that to lobby MPs to work with policymakers, key decision makers, to try and make the kind of lasting changes that we want to see as a charity that wants to see the end of problem debt in society.
definitely.
Absolutely. I mean, I have been a
Mm,
big fan of yours for a long time,
mhm,
and I'm constantly out there on my TikTok banging the drum about debt and how people can avoid getting into it in the first place, because that's quite a big thing. Personally for me, it was undiagnosed ADHD, spending
mhm,
addiction. And it's been a very rocky road for me.
mhm,
But I learned everything that I possibly could do about money so that I could educate my audience,
mhm,
launched the Mad About Money app, which has been a journey. And actually, we're noticing more and more people who are coming out as neurodivergent and, talking about the problems that they have with debt. So,
mhm,
neurodivergence and mental health, I think, are two very, very strong factors when it comes to debt. So, we will talk about that in a minute.
mhm,
But first of all, tell me a bit about Debt Awareness Week and how and why it's come about.
mhm,
So we go to Simon
So,
first.
mhm,
yeah, sure. So Debt Awareness Week, this is actually the 10th anniversary of Debt Awareness Week. So we started,
Amazing.
mhm,
yeah, back in 2014, and it's kind of full decade of a campaign that aims to raise awareness of debt issues, and the help and advice that's available to deal with them. So running from today, Monday the 18th, through to Sunday the 24th, we'll be focusing on some key barriers that we see as some of the main hurdles that
mhm,
people have to getting debt advice, whether people might be hesitating or how they can overcome those barriers and kind of take control of their lives.
mhm, definitely.
Brilliant. Okay. So, Greg, let's talk a bit about actually what is debt advice? What does it entail?
Mhm. Yeah. So I'd say the main kind of core of it is just giving information people don't always have access to.
Yeah.
What we found a lot is people don't really know the full scope of, what a credit card could do when you fall behind with payments, or what your creditors can do to enforce the debt, or even just kind of what options there are out there to actually handle that debt itself. So the very core of it, I would say, would be education. Like there are oftentimes we'll go through a full budget with someone, and to us, they don't really even need a solution.
Mm,
Essentially, they just need to kind of put all the debts in one place, have a look at the budget, look to make a few adjustments, tweaks here and there, and they're actually able to maintain the normal payment. So sometimes they just need a nudge in the right direction. So I'd say that's the core of it. Like debt advice is just education about something which not a lot of people have a lot of information about.
yeah, no, that makes sense. And what about
Mhm,
solutions? What about
mhm,
people who are, they're coming to you because they're so overwhelmed and they maybe
mhm,
can't pay, or
mhm.
they're overwhelmed because they've got too many debts?
So, I mean, so again, it all kind of comes down to the budget a client has. And one of the main things we'll always look at is, can you afford your normal bills? Because the worst thing we want is to put together a solution that handles that debt, but
Mm,
within 6 months' time, you've got further arrears on like gas, electric, rent, things like that. So, a main aim at the kind of at the start is just, okay, let's make this budget affordable where you can cover your normal costs. Like one of the things we say a lot kind of around the phones is just that it's the client first and it's the
mm,
debts which are a distant second. Like they've got to no no company can force you to like skip out on rent or skip out on food just to pay back a loan or a credit card bill, things like that. Um,
yeah,
in an ideal situation, what we do is kind of put together a budget which says this is enough for your normal costs, that leaves a set amount which is affordable for you to pay your debts back. And we can kind of help people arrange and make that payment and like almost be the middleman in those situations. So we're receiving the calls, emails from the creditors and kind of helping the client just manage their finances going forwards. And in some cases, with the best will in the world, there's only so much reduction you can make on costs.
yeah.
Sometimes, if we do a budget which is affordable, but it only leaves, say, £5 spare, or even less than that, it's unrealistic to expect to pay your debts back. So that is when we look into ways of essentially erasing the debt, what's called an insolvency. And there is a bit of a stigma around that. One thing we're focusing on for Debt Advice Awareness Week is breaking down all kinds of stigma that kind of circulates debt
Yeah.
advice. And truthfully, there's nothing wrong with having debt written off. Like, if
No.
you're at a point where generally it has to be a choice, you can either pay this debt back for the next 20 years, or you can have just this kind of one fee now to get yourself debt free. It is better to go down that route. And granted, it does have an impact on your credit file, but it's not like a roadblock, if you will. It's more of a speed bump. Like these things only stay on your credit file for a certain amount of time. And you can still get things like mortgages, further credit, if you do go down that route. So again, kind of tying back in the education I was talking about before, sometimes people just need a better understanding of what solutions there are out there.
I think so. So what stage should somebody be at before they come to you for help?
Um, Truthfully, if you're concerned about money, then come to us. Like, even if it means we've got to refer you towards someone else or like a different charity, or even if we do a budget and you don't need debt advice, then that's actually a great conversation we have sometimes. Just anytime you kind of find that, well, I'm kind of struggling to pay these bills. Like I've got that many debts where it's hard to kind of manage. Sometimes just having that conversation when, okay, these are my debts, let's lay them all out. That's sometimes what people need. Like one of the big things we're kind of hearing a lot from our clients is, I should have been in touch with you sooner. Like I wish
Yeah.
I'd called you guys a year ago or 2 years ago. But there is, especially with someone who is dealing with a neurodivergency, there can be that feel of like not just essentially not to address it. We'll push the letters aside. We'll deal with it another day, push it to the back of your
Yeah.
mind again. Not a very, very common conversation we have just to kind of push it away because it seems that overwhelming. So honestly, the best time is just if you genuinely feel like, okay, I'm struggling a little bit with these bills, I'm struggling a little bit with these payments. There's no harm in kind of just having that conversation. And truthfully, that kind of ties into something else we do with the Advice Awareness Week. People should honestly talk more about their debts.
Absolutely.
There
Yeah.
is this kind of thing where people feel, oh, it's uncouth or you shouldn't talk about it, it's embarrassing. But everyone like has some form of debt. Like the way our economy works, you need to have at least some form of debt to kind of get things like mortgages or further finance. So there's no shame in discussing about this. And like what we've always kind of said is once you've had that first conversation, the second one's easier from that point. So the main thing is just start talking about debt because then it's easier to talk about debt.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was that person in
Mm,
£40,000 worth of debt who used to
hmm
trip over their doormat because it had
mm,
so many letters underneath it. And speaking from personal experience, if you
hmm
don't face things before they start to get really bad,
hmm
that's when it starts to spiral. It starts to, you start to get bailiffs, you start to get court
hmm
orders and county court judgments, and those are the things which are really massively going to impact your credit rating down the line. So
Definitely.
I think it can be really hard for somebody to pick up
Mm,
the phone. But as you've said, you've got your web chat, which I think is absolutely brilliant because it kind of
hmm
takes away the face. But I think talking about debt and money in general,
mm.
we're such a stiff upper lip kind of country, aren't we? We're like,
We
oh,
really are.
can't talk about money. That's
Mm,
horrific. We can't do that. But actually, it's the thing that keeps us all together.
yeah.
And I think the more we talk about debt, the more we're going to normalize the fact that we are in a recession.
hmm
However small the government want to say it is still a recession, and there are lots of people who are struggling. So I think the more we normalize talking about it, the more you're going to
mm
realize that actually Sue next door's got debt, and Bob down the road at the pub's got debt, and it's
hmm
not the horrible stigma that it used to be. Even
Exactly.
things like IVAs and bankruptcy, they're not coming with the same stigma that they used to. It's a
hmm
way for people to actually get a fresh start and actually take control and start to fix things, because mental health, right? So let's talk about a bit about mental health. I
hmm
mean, Simon, what are your thoughts on debt and mental health?
I mean, I think that as a charity, we really understand how money wise
mm
and mental health are connected. They often come
Yeah.
hand in hand, and it can really be a bit of a vicious circle. So
hmm
the first thing I would say is that getting debt advice can help to break this. But
Yeah.
as you said, some people don't want to pick up the phone. They don't want to actually have to talk to people, and I think that's where at StepChange, it's fantastic that there's different ways that you can actually engage with that. So
hmm
our online debt advice service is available 24 hours a day, and that is available for you to go on, and you can go from end to end, from the very beginning to right through to getting a debt solution without ever actually having to talk to anyone.
Mm,
However, if you prefer to communicate in a way that says, I need to hear somebody's voice on the end of the phone, that option is also available to you. So straight
mm
away, you've got those sort of two options at either end of the spectrum to say, okay, this is how I would like to sort of address my debt in the first instance. But,
yeah.
I think that there's something further than that we also recognize that, common symptoms of mental health problems like difficulties communicating,
Mm,
impaired clarity of thought,
mm
reduced concentration or problem solving skills, those can all be really difficult barriers for somebody to
yeah.
take the first step to get debt advice.
mm
And we know it can be difficult to manage and control your finances, and you can feel overwhelmed about how to get help. And as I
Yeah.
say, that's where the kind of two different sides of getting debt advice, whether that's online or over the phone, really come into it. And we also refer and work with specialist organizations like Mind who can provide helpful
hmm
resources and support when needed. So, we recognize, and it is one of the barriers, the five barriers that we are talking about this week. One of which is obviously, people who have, issues with their mental health, but it's something that we're there to say, whatever you're experiencing, we're not here to judge you, and we're only
mm
here to help you deal with your debt problems.
Yeah,
mm
I think that's such a key word. It's the judgment.
hmm
People are scared of that, they've got that fear of judgment, and that if
hmm
they're going to phone, they're going to be like berated, or like they're going to be made to feel like they're really stupid. And
hmm
actually, there are so many reasons why people get into debt.
hmm
And it's not always because they want the thing.
Yeah.
I think people think, well, I've got into debt because I've spent too much money. Yes, but
hmm
there are so many other reasons. And especially in the neurodivergent community, ADHD tax. It's a massive thing. We don't talk about how many speeding tickets and parking fines and things like that we get, and actually then we forget to pay them, and they spiral down the road, and then like 6 months later you're like, oh, I've got all these things and they've gone to court, and now I'm going to bury my head in the sand because it's really scary. And I think it's that a lot of people don't necessarily feel like they can come and get debt advice because they're in too deep and they
Mhm.
can't afford to pay anything and that they've left it too late.
Mm.
What advice would you give people who have, got to the point where they've got so many debts that they're actually really struggling to actually make any payments and they're really stuck? Greg?
So again, first advice is just to speak to someone about it.
Yeah.
Again, ideally it would be someone like us, someone who's step change, you can give a bit of advice. But even if it means speaking to a partner or someone like that, so
Mm,
you've kind of addressed the elephant in the room. You've kind of spoke about that. Okay, now this next conversation is going to be easier. But what I'd always say is there is always at least some advice we can give, even if we do a budget and there's not enough money to kind of pay it back towards the debts. Sometimes what we can look into is prioritizing things. Like one of the a lot of what we hear from people kind of comes through this. I'm terrified about what this company can do. But the real reality is, as a country, we've put so many protections in place for
yes.
things like credit cards, loans, where people are limited. We've gone far beyond the days of bailiffs just turning up, kicking down
Mm,
doors and taking things away. There is tons of protection put in place. So sometimes the conversation we have is literally, okay, we don't have enough to go around. You need to kind of focus on these ones. These are your priorities. These people are just going to have to wait their turn. And as much as they kind of rattle the sabers and like put all kind of harsh language in these letters, a lot of these creditors are just they can't really do anything. Like they cannot force you to make a payment if it's flat out not affordable.
yeah.
And even then, we've got options like, okay, even if you don't want to deal with that stress, we can look in ways of getting the debt written off. There is always what I always say was no matter what the position ends up being within the budget, there is always something we can help you with, whether it
Yeah.
is just advice, whether we point in the direction of another charity, or whether we do arrange a debt solution ourselves. There is always some help you can gain from having that conversation with Step Change.
So with debt solutions, I think there's a lot of stigma and there's a lot of
Hmm.
kind of questions over what's the best one for the best circumstance. Now, yes, it's always going to sort of depend on what the person's individual circumstances are, but can
Hmm.
we talk a little bit around like what a debt relief order is? What's
Hmm.
what's a debt management plan? What's an IVA? What's bankruptcy? Like, and which one should you look at first?
Of course. I mean, you did hit the nail on the head there, Maddie. There's no kind of one solution fits all.
Yeah.
Some people may only have £5,000 of debt, but essentially they're not going to be able to pay it back. And like it's going to take them 30 years to pay it back. So for that
Mm,
person, we may recommend a debt relief order waiver race in the debts. Someone could be in, say, £50,000 of debt, but they have enough left over where they can clear the debt within 10 years. They just need a more manageable plan. Um, I'd say just for very kind of bare bones, a debt management plan is essentially a payment plan based around what you can afford. The way it worked with us and the vast majority of charities, we will put down what your income is, subtract what you're paying for the essentials like rent, electricity, food, and even personal costs as well, because you can't
yeah.
just live to pay these debts back. We'll look
Yeah.
at what do you need on a month-to-month basis? What does that leave over towards the debts? For step change, if you can clear the debt within 10 years, we'll at least recommend or consider a debt management plan. Just anything
Mm,
past that point, at least in our opinion, is just unreasonable to expect you to pay
yeah.
back. Um, an IVA is quite recommended these days.
Mm,
Essentially, it's a 5-year plan to pay part of the debt back, and at the end of the 5 years, have the rest written off. And it's seen a lot on adverts because they mentioned along the lines of you can write up to 90% of the debt off, things of that nature. And unfortunately, we do see a lot of kind of charge services who do pressure people
yeah.
into getting IVAs where it can be seen as the only way out. It's something else I would like to throw into there. Like whoever you seek that advice from, would always recommend at least speaking to a charity first. Doesn't have to be
Absolutely.
step
Yeah.
change, definitely, but a charity will never charge you for their services. So they will always give you at least the impartial advice and let
Mm,
you know whether this is right for you or whether it's someone selling you a solution, essentially. But the main reason I kind of brought that up, a lot of people come through asking for IVAs, but truth is, if you had to choose between a debt relief order, which essentially costs at the minute £90,
but they are
free
removing that cost again, aren't they? The
they are
government,
like coming in
supposedly.
So coming in April, that cost will either be reduced or gone altogether. But essentially, a debt ready forwarder freezes a debt for 12 months. If there's been no positive improvement to your situation, there's essentially a limit on how much you can have spare after your essential costs. At the minute, it's £75. If your situation stays the same for those 12 months, the debts are then written off from there. So again, sometimes people come through asking for an IVA, but the main kind of benefit to an IVA is it does protect assets.
Yeah.
Essentially, you can still have things like a mortgage or a car while still going for an IVA. If you want to see,
Even if you've got one at the time of
Mhm.
applying for the IVA, you can still have a mortgage and a car.
Exactly. There is some discussion about a release of equity, things like that, but the main thing is you don't have to sell any assets.
Yeah.
However, a bankruptcy does require you to sell any high value
Yes.
assets.
Yeah.
But the thing is, like, if you honestly are in a situation where you've got no mortgage, which a lot of people don't these days, you've got no
Mm.
kind of high value assets, a bankruptcy costs £680 to kind of go bankrupt, to go bankrupt.
I find that so
Oh
ironic.
no, it's
It's just,
it is quite a large fee. I mean, I would like to point out that there is help you can get for that. You can pay that in installments,
mm,
but when you consider how much over 5 years you'd pay into an IVA compared to the 608 you'd pay as kind of that
yeah,
one-off
true.
fee, in the long run, it is going to save you a lot of money. But there is just this fear about bankruptcy that if you go bankrupt, you can't have a bank account. It will haunt you for the rest of your life. It'll affect on that. But it's honestly not the case.
No.
So a very rough overview of kind of all those different solutions. But again, there's no shame in kind of having the debt written off. Sometimes that is the best option for people. And as always, I'd always say when you're seeking debt advice, come in with an open mind. Again,
Yes.
on paper, a debt relief order sounds perfect. Again, it pretty much erases debt within 12 months. But as it is so affordable, especially now, there are limitations, there are restrictions kind of attached to it. It's just to kind of prevent people racking up a huge amount of debt and then having the rest written off. So
Yeah.
a lot of the time, I get people saying, "Come to us and I want this solution," but honestly, sometimes it's not the right option for them for one reason or another, and there are better ways of handling that debt.
And I think, as we said before, it's not a one size fits all. It's a
Exactly.
what are your and there's so many moving parts, like
Mm,
what people do for a job. Because we were talking about this just before we started,
mhm,
that step change helps people with personal debt, but you don't
mhm,
help self-employed limited company directors, for example. That would be the
mhm.
business debt advice line,
So it's the business debt line. I
business
know
debt line.
yeah, again, it's a name that kind of worries a few people to think, oh, that's just for business debts. But we do honestly refer like directors of limited companies, people who are like self-employed.
Mm,
We refer people to them like for help with credit cards and loans, things like that. Um, Main reason being is it's less about the type of debt you've got, more just that pretty much any debt solution is going to have an impact on your credit file in some way,
yeah.
shape, or form. What we're concerned about with step change, we don't know how that affects someone who is self-employed. And
Mm,
what we take is to kind of recommend, okay, this will fix your debts, but if it means you can now no longer be a director, that's just going to land you in a worse position further down the line.
yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
exactly. But like I say, it's worth just at least having that conversation with us, even if it means we can't arrange a solution for you. We know who can help you out. So
Yes.
it's always better to have that initial conversation, see where we stand, and say, okay, you can't continue with us, but again, and I don't mean this in a negative way, but it's no skin off our nose. We're not relying on you to kind of pay our bills or anything like that. We're funded
No,
elsewhere.
no.
So we'll always give you a fair recommendation, if even if it means going to another charity.
No, that makes sense.
Mhm.
So Simon, what is the best way that people can actually support Step Change as a charity?
I mean, there's a number of ways that people can support. I mean, we don't sort of necessarily fundraise, I guess. So we're not a charity that really relies on public donations to exist. We're generally funded by financial institutions, people who kind of lend money, or other providers of services like utility companies and things like
Yes.
that,
Yeah.
and a small amount of government funding. So there's not support in that sense, but I think, as I mentioned earlier, a large part of what we do is sort of lobby government and policymakers on kind of key issues. So, following us on social media and amplifying some of the messages and the kind of calls that we're making to government around everything from, reform of the bailiff industry to more adequate benefits to help people who are on low incomes and things like that. So there's lots of ways that people can kind of get involved by amplifying the message that way. But really, a part of what Debt Awareness Week is all about is about raising awareness. And I think that, as Greg said earlier, there can be a kind of huge stigma about not reaching out, even if it's to a friend or a family member or anyone like that, and kind of keeping that information to yourself and sort of keeping those financial difficulties bottled up. And I think the stat is 92% of people who come to us say, I wish I got help sooner. And part of that is about taking that first step and reaching out to a loved one, a friend, whoever that might be. So another way that you can support us is simply by
recommending.
Exactly. Checking in on any friends who you think might be struggling and just pushing them to saying, have you thought about speaking to StepChange, sharing our details and kind of helping people to take that first step, because that can make such a huge difference to somebody who's struggling with their finances.
Yeah, I mean, like we have a community, like a really, really big community of neurodivergents in the Mad About Money app. And we are opening up conversations about this every single day. And we always point people in your direction. So and for me, it's really important because, I'm not a qualified debt advisor. I'm qualified by experience, which is horrific. Nobody wants that, but people come to me, they talk to me because of the fact that they know that I've been there, done that, and bought several of the t-shirts. That's the bad thing about ADHD. I buy all of them. But I'm not somebody who can say, yes, this is the right solution for you. I can, speak from my experience and I can talk about what's available, but I would never know what to say to somebody, because it's going to be down to the individual preferences. And this is why I recommend people to go to you rather than the people who are like, advertising on TikTok and saying, hey, come here and we'll write off 95% of your debts, because those people are there to sell you a solution. Exactly. And they're going to take a percentage of what you're paying off. And actually, you want to be paying that money off on your debts. You don't want to be paying somebody else for that privilege. So, in my mind, StepChange are the people who will give you an impartial, and there's nothing that you say to people that is going to be of monetary gain to you. So why would you give people the wrong advice? So that's what I say to all of the people that I work with. All of the people who hang out in my app, and you guys are obviously more than welcome to come and hang out in our app and talk about what you do. I'd love you guys to be sort of a bit more involved. I think that's a great way for us to partner for sure. So there's a couple of extra things that I want to know. So how does debt really impact your credit rating, Greg?
I'd say so. Just to kind of boil down to very brass tacks, it's essentially, if someone does a credit check on you, it says, okay, how likely they are to pay back this money I'm going to lend them. Like, just to use a mortgage as a very kind of general example, if they do a credit check and they see that, well, you've took out several loans, which is good, which shows that you are paying the money back. If it shows that they're defaulted, or if they've defaulted, or if they've been sold to the creditors, that tells me if I do loan you this amount of money, then there's a chance you might fall behind with payments. Same as if you do kind of have the debt written off. Now, we're going to do want to stress sometimes it is the right option for people, but it does kind of tell people who are doing a credit check that, well, they will receive this amount of money, it didn't get paid back, it in fact got erased. So it can affect things like that. Same as if some jobs which work in the finance industry, they'll see that as, well, you're not that good at managing your own money. So it can affect things like that. However, just to stress, things only stay on your credit file for 6 years. I know that doesn't sound like the shortest amount of time, but when you do kind of look at things from a grand scheme of, that's not just 6 years of inactivity, that's 6 years of you paying bills on time, potentially taking out smaller amounts of credit, like say £100 in a credit card and paying that back. That's 6 years of building things up again. So the longest something will stay on there is 6 years, and even then you can do stuff to build it up from there.
Yeah, that makes sense. What about, and I've had this situation this week where somebody has come to me on behalf of their girlfriend. So they're living together, the mortgage is in the guy's name, and his girlfriend has moved in with him. She has lots of debts, and he's worried about his credit rating. How does that affect him? And is there anything that he can do to help her apart from come to talk to you?
So firstly, just to give that peace of mind, zero impact on his credit file.
Brilliant.
Um, the closest you'll see is essentially the only two ways it could potentially affect it would be that if, say, he signed on as a guarantor for that debt, then
Mm,
he's now liable for it. But again,
right. Yes.
you can't be forced to become a guarantor. It takes a lot to kind of get signed on to that. The only that, and this is more of a hypothetical rather than anything else.
Mm,
If, say, it was a mortgage and they were considering a joint one, then potentially if they saw that one person had a poorer credit score rather than the other one, they probably would still go for the mortgage because they've got that guaranteed person. Your credit score is fine.
mm,
We have at least one person who will pay these bills and things like that back. So that's the only time I might come up if they're looking for some kind of joint debt. And even then,
yes. Yeah.
as long as they can see, well, we've got, and I hate using this term, but one reliable person kind
Yes.
of is
Yeah.
applying for it, that's going to affect it from there. And
Okay.
honestly, there's times when we do joint debt management plans. We look into joint accounts because it's easier.
Mm,
We've sometimes got people who aren't falling behind with credit cards, but their partner's kind of in a lot of debt. But if we kind of put the whole budget together and say, well, let's put the whole everything into this one pot of money. Let's reduce these costs here. That gives us this amount. This is easier for you both to manage and make payments back.
yeah.
So, and the only other thing I would say, aside from speaking to us, is honestly, if you've got that money spare, help them out. Like just a bit of money transferred across. I think that's kind of does tie into like again the shame we were talking about before
Yeah.
that some people don't want to ask for further money or ask for further help. But truthfully, the best thing you can do, because that money is not taxed or anything like that,
Mm,
transfer that money across, give them a little bit of help out, even if it just means they can balance that budget going
yeah.
forwards. That opens up a lot of options. Because one of the big things we're always concerned about is if we erase this debt now, if we put this plan together, are you going to fall behind in the future? Are you now going to fall behind with
Yeah.
rent, gas, electric? It's why we always want to make sure the budget is stable before we look at any debt solutions.
Yeah. I mean, I've been in the situation before where I've had debts and my partner's
Mm,
come and paid them off for me and just paid them off and not bothered telling me. And then he's like,
yeah.
"Oh, by the way, the bailiff turned up, so I paid one of your debts." And I'm like, "Oh my God, what was that
Mm,
for?" And he was like, "Oh, a parking ticket you didn't pay like 6 years ago." I'm like, "I'm really sorry."
mm,
But then my husband's just like, he kind of thinks it's like, "Oh, Maddie's brain. She does these
mm,
things every now and again." And he's just like, "Do you know what? I love you. I'm going to pay it off." And he's great. And I've done the same thing for him. So
mm,
if you've got family who are struggling and you can help them out, do. But one thing I would say, and this
mhm,
is the thing, like when I was in £40,000 worth of debt in my teens, the best thing that my mum ever said to me was, "No, I'm not going to bail you out."
mm,
And the reason for that was because I had to learn how to manage my money. I had to learn how to be frugal, how to,
mhm,
actually learn how to manage my money as an adult. And that was
mm,
hard,
mm,
but it was the best lesson I ever learned. And that's where you guys
mhm,
can help people. We can also help in Mad About Money app as well. We've got loads of
mhm,
free tools and resources, as do you guys as well.
mhm,
So um one thing that I get asked a lot,
mhm,
what if you've got loads and loads of debts and you've got
mhm.
debts on pretty much everything, how do you prioritize what to pay first?
Right. So what I'd always kind of look at is, at least kind of from a personal perspective, it's yourself first of all. Is there a roof over your head? Is there
Mm,
food on the table? Cover
yeah.
that first of all. That's fine. And then we'll kind of look down to the next debts. Okay, is this debt tied into like some kind of criminal fine or a parking ticket? Has it gone to a bailiff? If no, okay, push it further down the list. And again, then we're looking at utilities, anything that's tied into your household. And I'd say, kind of almost like third down the list from there. So again, you see, the more kind of we look into these debts rather than just seeing it as this massive ball of debt, we'll just
Yeah.
start dividing it. Okay, which ones do we need to focus on? Okay, well, I'm behind with the rent, so that one's kind of top of the list. This debt's gone to a bailiff, so the credit cards can wait for a while because they're not at that point. And again, this ties back in the conversation you can have with ourselves. Like if you come to us with a breakdown of your actual debts, like not just, okay, I'm £50,000 of debt. It's like I have £1,000 here, £1,000 that one. Okay, well, don't worry about these guys. These guys talk a big game. They've put a lot of threatening words in their letters, but in reality, all they can do is ask you to make a payment back. Or we've looked at this debt. This debt's actually gone past the statute of limitations, so you don't have to pay that debt. Well, you shouldn't pay that debt back whatsoever because it'll reset that statute. So again,
Can you explain what that is for people
of
who are
course,
listening who don't understand?
sure. So any kind of debt within the UK, for the vast majority, things like credit cards, loans, things like council tax have different rules, but for the vast majority of personalised debts, it's what's called statute barred. Essentially, if that debt is 6 years old and there has been a 6-year period of inactivity, that means there's been no action from your creditor who you owe the money to. They haven't issued like a default or applied for court action, and you haven't paid that debt back within 6 years. The debt essentially becomes unenforceable. Now, technically the debt doesn't disappear. The debt does stay there, but effectively, say it is Capital One, like a credit card, like that credit card company, they cannot take court action to enforce the debts. They can ask you to make a repayment, but essentially when you do make a repayment, it resets that 6-year time scale.
Okay,
So
good to know. Yeah.
they can be a little bit sneaky around it. So it's always, I'd say, best to speak to us first before you make any repayments back, just because we can look at these debts. Well, it's been 7 years for this debt, you've made no payments back. So if you get them to declare it statute barred, a lot of the time they do agree just to erase it because they can't take any action. But some of them just try and like, oh, we'll accept £1 a payment a month just for the time being. And again, that resets it. It
It's a
means
bad
they
thing
can
to
like,
do. Yeah.
exactly.
Makes sense.
Though I will say this, just the flip side, if anyone is kind of considering that, sometimes companies can apply for court action when they're getting near the 6-year time scale.
Right.
So it's what I'm just trying to avoid is anyone thinking, well, if I stop paying this debt back for 6 years, I don't need to worry about it. That's not always the case. Sometimes, especially if it's a larger amount of money, they'll be aware of that debt and like, well, we're at 5 years, 5 months now. Let's apply for a county court judgment. This will keep the debt enforceable. So it is sometimes a bit of it's kind of weighing the pros and cons essentially. Sometimes it's beneficial to make a pound payment back if you've not hit the 6-year time scale, because it can discourage them from taking court action. Other times, if you think you're getting near it and they haven't chased you, it may be worth just waiting or getting confirmation from them. But we don't expect anyone kind of listening to this podcast or like on the app, we don't expect you to make all these decisions yourself. Obviously, the home is to kind of come in and speak to us as well.
That makes total sense. And what about things like county court judgments and bailiffs? And is it better to try and kind of negotiate with these people yourself, or is it better to ask them for breathing space? And how can people deal with it when it goes that next step further?
So I mean, it does tie back into something you mentioned before yourself, Maddy, which I think is really important, that we try and help our clients out as best we can, but a big portion of it is actually them sometimes dealing with debt themselves. Sometimes we'll have a debt which can't be included in a debt management plan or something like that. So we'll make a recommendation, but you need to speak to them directly. Or even on a less kind of sense, sometimes people don't know their debt amounts or reference numbers. So the best thing you can do is speak to these companies directly, say that you're seeking advice, that you are looking to put plans together, and get that information from them. Like it's easy for me to say that because, again, it's my day-to-day job. I know the limitations of these people. We recognize it can be very intimidating to speak to them, but to kind of tie back into your question, there's massive amounts of limitations for these companies. It is good to speak to them, keep them in the loop, let them know what's going on. Like the more they're aware of, it's possibly that could discourage them from going to a bailiff or things like that. But if a debt does reach that level, again, unless we're talking about things like criminal fines or personal injury claims, they can never force you to make a payment you can't afford. A lot of what we see from bailiffs and enforcement agents is not exactly lying, but kind of giving you a half truth. One of the most common things they'll see is they'll get a letter saying, unless you pay £300 a week to clear this debt, we'll be coming around to do a control goods agreement and seizing your goods. Now, again, if you ever do get that like this, best thing to do is speak to us for us to determine what stage it's at. But the real reality is, unless an enforcement officer or bailiff, they need to gain something called peaceful entry. That means they have to the door's open and they can just walk in, or you open the door and let them in. If you do refuse entry and don't sign anything with them, legally they cannot force entry. They can only force entry if they've already been inside the property and they've signed that control goods agreement. That's the only instance when they can force entry and start taking stuff away. But you keep the doors and windows locked, you speak to them through the letterbox. Again, it can be very intimidating because they will say things like, unless you pay £600, we'll be coming back every day to try and take these goods. and they are within their power to do so. Like, we're essentially in a bit of a grey territory where they can ask you to make this payment and they can't force you to do so. But unless you kind of pay something they agree to, they can do return visits and try and intimidate you into making a
Yeah.
payment. But just for anyone listening, the protections are in place for you. There is a lot more protections in place for yourself rather than enforcement options for these enforcement agents.
I have actually had bailiffs at my door before,
Mm,
and this was back in like the early 2000s when I was
mm,
like at the peak of my debt, and I've been hiding from it for so long, and I've just been running
mm,
away. And I even moved to a different city because I thought they'll never find me there.
mm,
Little did I know about like credit reports, and like, yes,
mm.
they do track where you live, and as soon as you move, as soon as you get one letter sent there, they know where you are. But
Exactly.
I had somebody turn up on my doorstep, and thank heavens for those little chains that go across the door.
Mm,
I
yeah.
opened it with the chain, and he tried to put his foot through, and he couldn't get
Mm,
in. So then I packed up
exactly.
and moved somewhere else. But
Mm,
I did. That was the moment that made me go, right, this has gone too far. I
mm.
phoned my mum and I was like, Mum, I need help. I'm in so much debt. And
Mm,
she was like, and that was the hardest conversation I ever had to have. But
mm,
I sat down with my mum and she helped me to write a budget and we worked out how much money I was going to need for food every week. And I lived on £15 a week
mhm.
for about 3 years.
Yeah.
It was hard and I did a lot of yellow sticker shopping.
Mm,
But and if anybody wants to know how I got myself out of debt, come and have a look at my TikTok, Mad About Money Official. But I'm
mhm,
talking about it all the time. But it
mm.
was that realization of this has gone too far. I've
Yeah.
got a man trying to get in my house with his foot, like he's
Mhm,
going to come and steal my not that I had very much to take.
mhm.
But that was the realizing
Yeah.
moment for me. And it
Aye.
doesn't have
And
to get that far.
exactly. And I think you do have hit the nail on the head there. Like, truthfully, sorry, small thing to mention before going to my other
Mm,
points, that is actually now, I don't want to say illegal, but it's not allowed anymore. They cannot
no.
put a foot in the door jamb to kind of stop it
Yeah.
from closing, just in case anyone's worried about that. They can't do that anymore. But truthfully, most bailiffs, most enforcement agents, they don't want to take your stuff away.
Mm,
Essentially, what their kind of steps is first, they gain that peaceful entry. They will make a list of what they think is a high value item, what they're allowed to actually take. And there
mm,
is, again, massive limitations on what they can take based on how many people in the household, based on ownership, based on what kind of items are needed for someone's employment. But essentially, they'll make that list and they'll say, unless you pay me, again, it's always kind of, they'll say this is the lowest it can take. It's not. It's a figure they've come up with to pay the debt back as quick as possible.
yeah.
But they'll ask for something like £300 a month and say, if you don't pay this, I will come back and take these items. And truthfully, again, they take it back. They have to store it. They have to then sell it across. And with the best will in the world, how much are they actually going to get from a second-hand sofa or from like dining chairs, things like that? Like, they don't want to really take this stuff away. What they're banking on is people being intimidated.
Mm,
And a nice kind of point you made before about, you said your, again, husband kind of clearing that debt when a bailiff showed round. Now, while I'm all for kind of people, again, helping out family members or loved ones, truthfully, if a bailiff comes round, don't pay them anything. Speak to someone else first,
yeah.
just to understand their limitations. Because especially what we see with neurodivergent people as well is there's that initial panic. And
Yeah.
what they'll do is they will, again, put, like, they may have had like an emergency credit card and they'll put £600 on towards that, or they'll borrow money from a family member, and really it just gets them deeper in that section of debt,
Yeah.
especially if that payment isn't actually clearing the bailiff debt. If it's just, well, we want £600 a day, we'll come back. And it can be just that initial thought of, no, just whatever it takes to keep them away from the door, pay it now. And it doesn't kind of fit in the long run. So
Yeah. No,
we know,
that makes sense.
we know it's scary. We know they can be really intimidating, someone coming to your door, but again, chain on the door, don't let them in, don't sign in with
Yeah.
them. Seek advice first before you make any payments back,
Yeah.
because we'd hate for them to like pay the rent money towards them when it's not really needed.
Mm. Ring doorbell as well. Ring
Mm,
doorbells are great.
exactly, yes.
You can see what they look like. Simon, is there anything that the government are doing to help? Are there any grants or anything that the government can do to help anybody who's in debt?
I think that there's lots of things that the government can do and
Mhm,
should do. I think over the last sort of 4 or 5 years, especially, I think that the way that help has been kind of apportioned to people has really changed. We saw
mhm,
with furlough,
Mm,
government coming in with huge levels of support for people. There have been lots of grants. We actually lobbied for a COVID rent debt grant, which was put in place a couple of years ago. We've seen cost of living payments. What we're really concerned about now is that there's kind of come a tipping point, I think, where, because a lot of the sort of key measures of financial difficulty are ostensibly going down. So we're seeing inflation, going down. We're seeing interest rates have kind of stalled at an admittedly very high level, but they're not going up any further. That there's a sort of narrative there that the worst is over. We've turned a corner. Things are getting better. However, we know that from the people that we're seeing that sort of budgets have never been lower, essentially.
Yeah.
So just to give you an idea, in the last 3 months of last year, the average budget surplus that a new client had coming to us was £2. So after which is astonishing. So that's how much the average person would have to pay towards their debt after their essential outgoings came out. So it's not much, and these are the kind of margins that we're seeing people dealing with on a day-to-day basis. I think that's the way that the profile of debt has really changed. And so what we're really keen to see from government now is looking at those really key issues that are going to be affecting people. So are benefits adequate? Is there enough support there to help people with, for example, debt that's been accrued through the cost of living crisis in terms of utilities? Obviously energy debts at about £5.5 billion at the moment. Council tax, also huge amounts of debt. So are the support mechanisms in place for people to be able to comfortably deal with that debt and really get back on their feet? Because as Greg said, it's one thing us saying, okay, we can put you on a solution or we can help you with your budgeting, whatever. But the fact is, if the structures aren't there to support people to sustain a regular budget, in the long term, what we'll see is people just coming out of debt, getting a debt solution, and then 6 months later, they're
going
back
straight.
in debt.
Yeah. So that leads me on so nicely to my next and final question. How can people kind of prevent the whole debt cycle from starting again? How do people, if you've got people who are kind of really struggling with cost of living, which thousands and millions of people are at the moment, how can you prevent yourself from getting into debt in the first place? And what can you do for people who kind of think that they might be heading towards that situation?
So I
You can
think
both
Greg
answer it.
and I
Both
probably
answer it.
both got quite a lot to say on this. I'll try to sort of keep mine as short as possible. I think the main thing is, and we've touched on it already, is really having that sort of handle on what you've got going in and coming out. So absolutely knowing each month, okay, what's my budget? How much do I have to put towards all of my essential spends? What's my and if you do have any money left over, can you put some aside to build up a buffer to make sure that if something happens, which is almost overwhelmingly the most common thing that we would see, is somebody saying, I was absolutely fine, and then bam, something happened. I lost my job. I suffered from ill health. A close family member died, or something like a pandemic happened.
I mean, that thing, we're still talking about it 4 years later. I mean, it was the nail in the coffin, and it was the thing that went, made normal people, I say normal people, like people who are, even kind of middle class, fairly well off, not on too bad a salary. That's the thing that switched it for everybody, wasn't it? And then not being able to recover properly afterwards.
And I think, that there's something that we've spoken about quite a lot today about, the idea of why debt happens. And I think that one thing which is, I wouldn't call it a positive, but I think it's definitely been a change, is that I think people have suddenly started to see, wow, there isn't something that people just get themselves into. And I feel like before the pandemic, that was the narrative around debt, and it's why there is so much stigma and shame attached to it, because you would often get people saying, oh, this person's gotten themselves into debt, they've overspent, it's their fault. And suddenly people are seeing, wow, unforeseen events absolutely financially derail you at a moment's notice,
Mm,
and it's incredibly difficult to get back on track. So,
yeah.
you know, I would say in terms of your question about kind of future proofing your finances, about kind of trying to make sure that you're, you know, able to withstand that life shock. I think
Mhm.
having that in your mind, can you build up a little bit of a buffer of savings? Can you make
Yes.
sure that you're really on top of everything that you've
Mhm.
got going in and coming out, so that, you know, should the worst happen, there is that sort of, yeah, little bit of a safety net there to
Yeah.
catch you. But
Mhm.
yeah,
I
Greg,
mean,
Mhm.
oh God, I mean, I think we could probably talk about this for hours. I mean,
Oh, definitely.
something that I see an awful lot is like parent shaming.
Mm.
Parents who have, had kids, and it's always the, oh, well, if you can't afford to have kids, don't have kids. And
Mhm.
it's like, well, when I made the decision to have two kids, like I was on an 80 grand salary and this was
Yeah.
fine, and everything was hunky dory, and then my situation
Mhm.
changed, and then nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition, do they? And it's
Mhm.
all about circumstances. And I think people actually normalizing the fact that something can change at the flick of a switch.
Mhm.
I wasn't expecting my last business to go under,
Mhm.
and I also wasn't expecting that when it did go under, that I would end up in £35,000 worth of debt because of personal guarantees that I hadn't read the small print on. People will say, "Oh, well, that's really stupid. You should know better." And it's like, well, yes,
Mhm.
I should, but I'm neurodivergent, and actually, I don't do things the way that normal people do.
Mhm.
And that's a really difficult thing, and that I think it's something that the more we talk about it, the
Mhm.
more open and honest we are about the struggles that people have with their mental health, with neurodivergent conditions,
Mhm.
with life, with parenting.
Mhm.
This is why in Mad About Money app, we don't just talk about money. We talk
Mhm.
about all of the things that lead back to your money. So we talk about parenting and health and fitness and well-being and all
Mhm.
of the things that actually really impact your money.
Mhm.
Because it's so important to kind of consider everything from every angle and try and be a bit more prepared. Greg, what's your thoughts
Mhm.
on protecting?
So I mean, one thing I did want to kind of mention, it's kind of mentioned at the start, like one of the things we're looking at is to get a society free from problem debts.
Yeah,
Like one thing I'd like to people to keep in mind is just having a credit card or a loan doesn't mean you're in problem debts. Problem debt kind of
yes,
comes from when the debt is hard to maintain, when it's a struggle to manage, that's when you've got a
yeah.
problem. But just having the debt doesn't necessarily mean you're in trouble. Again, still worth a conversation, be concerned about it. But
Mm.
on a small note, I honestly recommend people using cash. And one of the things I've found, especially these days, is money almost doesn't feel real. It's kind
Yeah,
of there's, well, I budget myself, say £300 a month for groceries, but they're not considering, well, 5 days out of the week I get a Greg's breakfast on the way to town
it's my
because
my saving.
exactly.
I'm a big cash lover. I mean,
Yeah.
like,
And it
I
it
mean,
makes it
I think
seem
it's,
more real.
yeah,
Yeah.
it does. It, especially for neurodivergence, it's
Mm,
so like having something tangible to
hmm
hold. And I'm constantly talking about protecting yourself from like the beep,
mm,
because the beep is almost not real, is it? It's like that tap and
exactly.
go, and it's not a real thing. And
Hmm
okay, yes, your bank might send you a little alert to say you've just
mm,
spent some money, but it's like it's pretend play money.
exactly.
Totally with you.
Um, and I mean, you've kind of hit the nail on the head. Like it's easy enough to kind of say to someone, "Oh, just budget, maintain that." But and again, sometimes that's the advice we give. But honestly, as soon as you kind of introduce children into a budget, budgeting itself becomes 10 times harder because,
It
especially if
does.
you're dealing with
Yeah.
younger children, I mean, again, you don't want them. You kind of want to find that fine line between you're not spoiling them, but you're also giving them some kind of joy as well. But again, you might generally have, I mean, honestly, even adding neurodivergent children there as well, you could have it where, well, I managed to get my groceries down to £300 a month. Or, but we've now kind of found out that my son will only eat this certain type of food, which is an additional extra £50 on top of that
I
as
mean,
well. Um,
don't even talk to me about
oh,
neurodivergent children and their food habits. Like,
exactly. Or, but even stuff just which is and again, like that's outside the control anyway. But
mm,
when you look at school costs, how much school uniforms are costing nowadays,
yeah,
things like that. So what I would say is again, just if you feel that things are becoming a bit strained, speak to someone. Sometimes just
yeah,
having kind of a budget straight off the bat makes things a bit more manageable. Means there's money you can put aside. Like, and no one saw the pandemic coming, no one saw like accidents coming, things like that. But it gives you a bit of a safety net there. And truthfully, if we do a budget and says, well, what you're receiving at the minute just isn't enough, rather than you relying on overdraft and relying on savings, have a talk with this charity. Like with you being a
Yeah.
parent, you might be eligible for this grant or this trust fund.
Yes.
And again, it ties what we were saying before, like there can be this feeling of, well, we both work, we both have income, we're not eligible for any kind of benefits. And truthfully, in it, may not be, but you can have that
You never
conversation,
know.
see, is there something I'm eligible? Is there a little bit of extra funds? Because the budget I've just done there, without me paying anything back towards my debt, it shows that I'm £50 in a deficit. And that's with
Yeah.
them cutting down as much as they can. Like sometimes what they get just doesn't stretch far enough.
Greg, thank you so much. And Simon, thank you. This has been an absolutely amazing conversation. And I think we need to
Mhm.
have more of them. We need to
Oh,
carry on with
definitely.
this. Simon, where can people find StepChange? Tell people where to go and follow you.
Yeah, so it's really, really straightforward. Just search for www.stepchange.org, all the information about how to follow us. We're on all the major social channels, so
Mhm.
X, Facebook, TikTok, Instagram. You can find us on there, and we're regularly posting information, tips, especially on our on our TikTok. Over the next week, we also have a really interesting Ask Me Anything on
Mhm.
our personal finance on Reddit, which is really, really well subscribed. So if you have any questions, if you want to ask us anything about a particular issue that you're going through, I really recommend going to the personal finance
Mhm.
subreddit and kind of logging onto that later on this week. And we run those pretty regularly as well. So
Mhm.
yeah, as
Amazing.
I say, stepchange.org for any information about us. So
Exactly.
Fabulous.
Mhm.
Well, thank you so much, both of you, for coming
Mhm.
on. StepChange, an amazing charity. I think you guys are amazing. I really appreciate you coming on. And also thank you everybody for listening.
Mhm.
That was probably quite a hard listen for some of you. If you haven't already done it, please do hit the subscribe button, hit that subscribe on Spotify, Apple Music, wherever you're listening to your podcasts, or even YouTube. You can join my 57 followers, which is great. And if you haven't done it already, come and download the Mad About Money app. It's completely free. I'm Maddy Alexander-Grout. You can follow me on TikTok, Mad About Money Official. And thank you guys so much for listening. We will see you next time.